Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is Econ441. It's the second of the two pre-recorded lectures for my trip to Japan. I decided to do this one as a slideshow rather than as a presentation in front of a whiteboard because so much of what I needed to cover is data-driven, and this is the best format to get the data up and ready. And there are no real diagrams or things of that sort in this lecture. It's just basically a review of the data and some of the ideas that we've kind of developed in the previous lectures. So what we're going to do today is kind of take a look at the history of deficit finance in the U.S., mostly in the 20th century. And we'll start with just kind of a general outline and connecting it back to what we had in the previous lecture. So generally speaking, if you look at deficit finance in the U.S. In the 20th century, it looked quite a lot like the Ramsey model until about 1975. That is, we would have a good deal of deficit spending during crises, which mostly were World War I and World War II, and then bits and pieces of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And other than that, we had very close to balanced budgets and often ran surpluses, and those small deficits and small surpluses were sufficient to cause the size of debt relative to GDP to decline basically during periods away from the crisis. And this declining was important, okay, because it meant that in principle we could borrow again on international markets should we need to address future crises. So after 1965, that stopped happening. Deficits started to increase as a fraction of GDP, not monotonically, but generally. And so the fraction of the size of debt relative to GDP tended to be increasing during most of that period after 1975. So this is a plot of the deficit as a fraction of GDP. The reason for looking at deficits as a fraction of GDP is that, well, you don't have to worry about price indices and inflation and things of that sort if you do the measures compared to GDP. And so it reduces a lot of kind of data issues when looking at the numbers. And if you look at this, you can see that a really large deficit occurred in this period. And that's basically the 1940s. That's basically spending for World War II, which was very expensive in many respects, many lives lost. Much of the economy devoted to war output instead of consumer goods and durables, and lots of deficit spending. But you can see after that period we had basically a balanced budget or some surpluses and some deficits, running up until about this period right here, which is around 1975. And if you went back before, I don't have that on the diagram on this chart, you'd see that a relatively similar pattern took place in that period as well. So you can see there's by historical standards, there's a fairly large deficit during the Great Depression. It's not large as a fraction of GDP compared to what we do, in the contemporary period when our recessions are much milder and much better insured against through all the various safety net programs. And you can see that basically, during the COVID period, we had a fraction of GDP. The deficits as a fraction of GDP were nearly twice as large as they were during the Great Depression of the 30s. So one thing we can do now is we have two theories based on micro theory and one theory based on macroeconomics that tries to account for this pattern. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the previous slide and we'll and take a look at it a little bit more closely. That is, if I could go back. It looks like I can't go back. Okay, if you look at the other slide, you would see that deficit spending is not highly correlated with recessions. Right? In a Keynesian model or a new Keynesian model, you should see deficit spending take place during recessions because it's a counterweight to the recessions and trying to kind of smooth out the economy. But generally speaking, there's almost no correlation between the deficit spending that we observe in U.S. history as a fraction of GDP and whether we're in a recession or not. If anything, deficit spending follows a couple years after the recession is over, and it kind of accelerates the boom, which is already underway, generating more macroeconomic instability, at least from the point of view of Keynesian theory. So I think you can reject basically the macroeconomic explanation for deficits. Okay, the only sense in which they have a bearing on it is that there's some reduction in tax revenues associated with recessions, and that ordinarily would tend to generate a decrease or an increase in deficit spending if budgets were kept constant. But you don't see much evidence of even that effect in the data series. There's some, but not as much as you'd expect. The Ramsey model that we reviewed in the previous lecture says basically you should have more or less balanced budgets when there's not a period of crisis, and you have deficits during a period of crisis, which could be either an economic crisis like a major recession, or it could be a war, or it could be, in the case of recent history, the pandemic. And we do see expansions during crises. Okay, so that's consistent with the Ramsey type of approach. We also see, at least up until about 1975, something that resembles balanced budgets in the U.S. With some surpluses, some deficits, but basically oscillating around a true balanced budget. However, after 1975, it stopped being true. And there are various reasons for that. One explanation proposed by Buchanan and Wagner was that the Keynesian revolution that took place in macroeconomic theory in the 50s and 60s caused politicians to stop worrying about deficits and basically embracing them as a tool of increasing government, increasing both the size of government services they could deliver to consumers and voters, and at the same time they could be feeling like they were contributing in a positive way to economic growth rather than in a negative way. And you could say that's part of what's going on. But the other thing that you can point to is the Buchanan-Rollback model, which says that somehow during that period in the 60s and 70s, there's a cultural shift in the U.S. that tended to in a sense, disconnect the current generation from the future generation, and more of a live for today kind of attitude was adopted by pivotal voters somehow during that period. And as a consequence, there's less thought given to the fact that future generations might have to service and retire the deficit. And so basically there was just a bias in favor of deficit spending from then on that basically was large relative to what it had been in the past. Okay, I think for the past 50 years, that's probably a better model than the Ramsey model or the Keynesian model. Okay, so this is the size of national debt as a fraction of GDP. And if you look at it, it doesn't go back as far as the series I had up before. So this one is starting, well, around 1970, I guess. So just before that general increase in deficit spending. You can see that rather than kind of holding the overall deficit more or less steady at around 20%, which is what it had been for years, except for during World War II. You can see that basically the size of the national debt as a fraction of GDP went up quite a bit into the 90s. Oddly enough, in the 90s, during the Clinton administration, with a Republican Congress, we actually had quite good fiscal restraint for about 6 of those 8 years, and that actually brought the deficit down as a fraction of, or the total debt down as a fraction of GDP, not back to the 20% range, but more down to the 30% range. And then the Bush administration more or less held at that level. And you can see that after that, partly because of the 2008 recession, what they call the Great Recession, we had a great expansion towards the end of the Bush administration, and then that expansion continued through the Obama administration and through the Trump administration. And I guess there's a little bit of a sign that maybe we've been coming down for a year or two towards the end of the Trump administration, beginning of the Biden administration. But basically, we're at levels of debt held by the public that are twice what they were in the Bush administration, which is not that long ago, and more than 3 times what they were back in the 50s and 60s. So far, I think you could say that we haven't paid much of a price for that, but that doesn't mean we won't pay a price in the future. Okay, so what are the problems with having this large national debt? First, there is the Buchanan-Roback problem of unfair shifts in debt to unconnected parts of future generations who will pay debt service or pay down the debt without benefiting from services financed with those taxes, with that borrowing. So there are some exceptions. So if you borrow for public education or to invest in major capital projects that are durable, then some of those projects and some of the benefits of education accrue to that next generation. But for the most part, the deficit spending is on all kinds of things, much of it unrelated to the welfare of future generations. The second problem is that at some point, and this varies with the country, what that point looks like. It's probably higher for the US than it would be for most other countries on the planet, partly because the dollar is used as a reserve currency in so many countries, and so they're holding both dollars and US government bonds at a greater rate than they would otherwise be holding them. But nonetheless, at some point, worries will start to be introduced into the international bond market about whether we would properly service the debt, and and some risk premium would start to be built into the interest charged on those loans, which would cause deficits to increase further unless we reduced expenditures or increased taxes. And the third problem, which is something I've started to think about more in the past 20 years, is that one of the things that the central government uses deficit finance for is dealing with crises. And if you look at that pattern, that history of debt, much of the debt has been accumulated during crisis periods. So World War II, the Great Recession of 2008, 2010, and the COVID episode. And it's very useful to be able to go to international bond markets when there's a period of crisis and borrow to provide these kind of emergency services that voters generally think are necessary and that elected officials agree are necessary. And if your access to those international debt markets declines, you're going to be less able to use debt finance to cover these exceptional periods of high demands for particular crisis ameliorating services from the government. And that will mean that the crises will be more painful and more difficult to address in the future than they have been in the past. So I would say we still have some slack in the U.S. Access to international bond markets, but we're getting up there, up to the point where that slack is going to disappear, and so problems 1, 2, and 3 are all problems that are serious ones. It turns out that solutions are actually pretty easy in principle. Essentially, it's simply arithmetic. We have to either increase taxes, reduce government services and expenditures, or do some combination of the both in the future, or accelerate economic development so that the tax base expands fast enough to cover our increasing demands for these services. So the last one we don't really know how to do very well. We know how to cause recessions as economists. So I think if you more or less handed any economist a magic wand and let them do whatever they want to with policy, they could induce really major recessions easily. So we're pretty good at that. We understand recessions and depressions. But economic growth is more complicated. I think we have general ideas about how to do that, having to do with opening markets up, investing in education, providing some support for patent and protection of new ideas, and allowing more or less open entry into most markets. But there's no guarantee that you're going to get fast growth out of that, because that's partly a matter of innovation, and you never know what new ideas will catch on and actually improve things. Those innovations are inherently unknowable because they're new things. They're things that we haven't seen before. Even though we might kind of guess what they might look like, we'll often be wrong about it. So the other two, the increased taxes, reduced services, wind up being the ones we actually can easily control. And to do that, there are a couple of things you could do. One is because we accumulate so much debt during crises, is that we could start trying to pay for what I have called crisis insurance. So after a crisis emerges, crises are also things you typically can't foresee. After a crisis occurs and you've dealt with it, then it makes sense to have kind of a crisis premium tax targeted at the people who benefited most from the crisis preventing or reducing services, and to kind of basically get them to pay for that special kind of insurance that was provided. In some cases, the crisis insurance is arguably economy-wide, as it might be during a recession, a major recession. And then that would just be a temporary increase in taxes to kind of pay back the crisis insurance. Another possibility, which was talked about during the 90s, believe it or not, when we were actually doing pretty well at controlling the deficits. I suppose that part of this discussion implied that many serious people were concerned about deficits during that period. And so just day-to-day politics also had some effect at restraining in the growth of government services in that period. But nonetheless, there were several proposals for constitutional amendments that would restrict deficit spending and call for balanced budgets over some period of time. Not necessarily year to year, but something close to year to year, except in emergencies of some kind. It turns out that state governments in the US mostly have balanced budget rules that they have to adhere to. There's a variety of these rules at the state level, but on average, it induces states to really curtail their borrowing over what it would otherwise have been. For the most part, you can't see any adverse effects to those restrictions on deficit spending at the state level. So it's possible that one could introduce an amendment that would, constitutional amendment that would have effects similar to those state constitutional rules on the national budget. So 2 and 3 are things that would kind of, in a sense, create a procedure for reducing deficits, a standing procedure that would tend to reduce deficits, with number 2 basically reducing the accumulated debt by retiring crisis related debts after the crises are over. So it bears noting that consumer borrowing has increased during the same period, but it's actually been declining in a sense. And I'll end the talk with a look at the percentage change in consumer loans year to year from the Federal Reserve data set. And that will close up this lecture, and I'll see you for the review after the exam. Pardon me, the review for the exam after the Thanksgiving break. For those who are paying attention, you might have noticed that I've also included a link to last year's pre-recorded review for the second exam, and I put that link up with some hesitation, but some of you may find it useful as a kind of way of quickly reviewing the material that we've covered up to now, and it might help you get started in working on the review on the study guide. So mostly, I think the study guide is the best source of material to review. But you might like that rather brisk review that I put together last year. It's not a perfect substitute for the real lectures and for all the lecture notes that you all have accumulated, but it's a kind of quick review, quick tour back through those lecture notes. You might find it useful. So with that, I'll see you after Thanksgiving, and hope you had a pleasant holiday, and I'll see you soon. Bye.